After this is Godfather. Send your traffic. Over.
Roger. Line Sierra. 4 enemy personnel. Break.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Green Side Podcast. I am your host, Taylor Mooney. I have a very special guest with me today. I have President Emeritus James Wright. I'll give you a quick background on President Wright real quick. He is President Emeritus and a Leeser Wheelock Professor of History at Dartmouth College. He served as president from 1998 until June 2009. A member of the Dartmouth faculty since 1969, he also served as Dean of the Faculty from 1989 through 1997, and as acting president of the college during the first 6 months of 1995. You also served as provost from 1997 through 98, and finally you were elected president in April of 1998. You're also the author of your newly released book, Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War. I want to welcome you, sir, today. Thank you for coming on.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Taylor.
Absolutely. So real quick, if we're going to do a little bit of your background, we'll talk about your book a bit. If someone were wanting to purchase your book, where can they go? Amazon.com or?
Oh, I think Barnes & Noble, Amazon, then go to local bookstores. Certainly here, the Norwich bookstore, the Dartmouth bookstore, they have it, sure.
Okay, outstanding. And so we'll get into the coolness of your book, but I think your own narrative, to me, I mean, when I first met you, I thought was just so neat. So I'll let you tell. You can start off from when you joined as a young man in the Marine Corps.
Yeah, I joined the Marines in 1957. I just graduated from high school. I was 17 years old, and I joined with 4 of my high school friends, graduating class friends. And in the 1950s in small town America, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest. We faced the draft, and the Marine Corps was an option that many people in my town chose, rather than waiting to see if they'd be drafted or not. And I spent 3 years in the Marines, and I got out in 1960 and decided I would go to college. Nobody in my family had done that, and so I spent 4 years at a nearby school, Wisconsin State College, now part of the University of Wisconsin system. While I was there, I worked. We didn't have a GI Bill then. I was a peacetime GI, and so I worked as a bartender, as a night watchman, as a janitor, and I worked in the mines. I worked underground in the local mines. And I was a powderman setting dynamite charges. I recall when my shift boss asked me one day if I was working on a drill machine underground. He asked me if I'd like to be a powderman. He needed somebody to be a powderman, and I said, I've never handled a stick of dynamite in my life. And he said, well, you're in the Marines. And I said, I don't care. I've still never touched a stick of dynamite in my life. And he said, we can show you how to do that pretty easily. And he said, I'll pay you, I think it was 20 cents more an hour. And I said, you mean $2.35 an hour? And he said, yep, I'll give you $2.35 an hour. And I said, okay, you've got yourself a powderman. So I worked as a powderman in the mines. I graduated with a degree in history and English, and was fortunate to have a fellowship, a Danforth fellowship, which allowed me to go to graduate school any place that I wanted. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison, completed my PhD in American history in 1969, and came to Dartmouth that year. I'd never been in New England before that, and I thought, well, I'll go for a few years, and here I am now, 48 years later, hanging on, and it's been a wonderful place to be over these years.
So what initially drove you? You were doing these different odd jobs. You were making money working as a night watchman or working in the mines. Where did your passion or your drive to go to school, where did that come from? Why did you decide school was a route for you at that time?
I thought I'd like to teach. I decided I'd like to be a high school history teacher, actually. Two of my aunts had gone to school in the late 20s, early 30s during the Depression, for 6 months, where they were credentialed to teach in one-room rural schoolhouses, and so They always encouraged me to think about teaching. My dad had tried to go to college during the Depression, but he only lasted one semester. He just didn't have the money to do that. And so teaching was something that I valued very much. And I thought maybe I'll be a coach. Maybe I'll go to be a high school history teacher and help coach football or something. So that's what started it. And then I obviously became a history teacher, which is what I wanted to do, but I did it at this wonderful school, Dartmouth.
Right. And what made you choose Dartmouth? Was it just you put out some applications and this one came back, or is it a specific?
They offered me a job.
Is that simple?
People entering the job market know that sensation well. They were. I had applied for several jobs, 68, 69. It was not as good as a few years earlier in terms of the academic job market, but it was not as tight as it would be a few years after that. And I had been nominated for a few jobs, had an interview, and then came here for an interview. And Dartmouth moved quickly in the fall of '68 and offered me a position to teach American political history, and I accepted and came here.
So you came here in 1969, which was, really during the height, I would say, around the height of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
What was Dartmouth's campus like during that time, and how did your previous time as a Marine play into like how you fit in with the community or how you felt things were going on?
Well, I didn't talk a lot about being in the Marines. Friends of mine certainly knew I had been, but it wasn't something that I talked about. I was by the 67, 68, probably 67, maybe even before that, I come to have some real reservations and then more than reservations about what we were trying to do in Vietnam. And I did oppose the war. I didn't march in Madison, but I was involved with the McCarthy campaign in 1968 and came here. The big buzz on campus when I came in 1969 was that the previous spring, in May of 1969, when students had occupied Parkhurst Hall, and there were a number of disciplinary cases pending for those students when I came in '69, and this was a matter of a great deal of attention and controversy on campus. What was the college's discipline going to be for these students that had occupied the president's office? And then in 1970, in the spring, when President Nixon sent American troops into Cambodia, and that was followed by the shootings at Kent State and at Jackson State. Basically, this campus closed down in the spring of 1970. I went down to Washington that spring with a number of Dartmouth students. We didn't go and join any rallies. I don't know if there were any when we were there, but we met with some people from Congress and other places. I just wanted to go down and be of support to them, and to encourage them to try to work with the Congress on this. I was by then very critical of the war, but I was never critical of the kids who were serving over there. I had an understanding that, for all I knew, some guys that I was serving with in the Marines were over there. If they were, we weren't keeping in touch with each other. I don't know that for a fact, but I have no doubt that a number of them were over there, and I just thought that they were standing up and doing what they were asked to do at a very difficult time.
Right, absolutely. And so I'm assuming that having, that was the beginning of your professional career. It's a very formative time. Added on that you're an historian. It's led you now later on in life to, or throughout your life, to write books and write publications about war and about the troops or about soldiers. And most recently, you did write Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation and Its War. What is your new book about? What is the?
Well, my book is about the American generation, the baby boomer generation that served in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. But just to back up for a minute on your comment there and your question, I'm not a military historian. I had my writing was really on American political history and the history of the American West. I taught the American West course here for a number of years, and I wrote on that. I really turned to military history, I think, because after my first year after I stepped down as president, because I have been involved by then in a number of veterans activities, and I have been visiting Walter Reed and Bethesda hospitals since 2005 and was very much involved with veterans. I had helped to set up a counseling program at Walter Reed, that's Bethesda, that's still in place there, counseling men and women who have been hospitalized as a result of the war. And I was involved in helping to set up, to do the language for the GI Bill that was passed in 2008. The Yellow Ribbon Program was my contribution to that, which does make a difference at places like Dartmouth. And so that first year after I stepped down from the presidency in 2009, 2010, I was invited, first of all, to speak at the Vietnam Memorial on Veterans Day 2009, and it was really quite an honor to be invited to speak there. And I did, and then I spoke later that year, early in the winter of 2010 at Berkeley, and I gave the Jefferson Lecture there, and I talked about war veterans and American democracy. And in doing this, I was struck. Well, when they first invited me to speak at Berkeley, when the chancellor sent me the invitation, they asked if I would talk about the work I've been doing with veterans. And I said I would, but I'm a historian, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the way that America has treated the veterans of our wars. And I was frustrated to discover that there weren't a few books that I could look at and give me the background for this, because it was not my area of specialty. And I recall a dear friend of mine saying, quit whining about the absence of a book and write one yourself. And so that led to the book that was published in 2012, Those Who Have Borne the Battle, which is a history of America's wars and those who fought them. It's every war from the American Revolution to the war in Afghanistan, who we asked to fight these wars, how we treated them when they came home. And the big elephant in the room, I had a chapter in that book on the Vietnam War, and that remained. Anyone who's interested in issues having to do with veterans in the United States has to always circle back to the Vietnam War. It's interesting, Taylor, those of you who are veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are veterans of wars that have proved to be, finally, after a number of years, equally unpopular, if I can put it that way, as was the war in Vietnam. The difference is that you've not been treated when you came home as somehow accomplices in that war. People have instead applauded you. Now, there are lots of things at play there, but that wasn't true of the Vietnam generation, and I wanted to try to understand that better. I had written a few op-ed pieces, and I thought I might do something on the Vietnam generation, but I very quickly realized that this is far more formidable to take on than an op-ed. Right. And even though I hadn't planned to write another book, I did. And I interviewed 160 people for it. I interviewed mainly veterans, and almost all of them are combat veterans. I was really interested in the kids who served and sacrificed and died in Vietnam. Who were they? Who were these young men and women whose names are engraved on the wall? And when I spoke at the wall in 2009, I talked about this issue. We've got to remember that these are more than names inscribed in stone. These are young men and young women who had a lifetime of plans and a lifetime of dreams ahead of them. And it's our obligation to make certain that we remember them for that, for who they were. And I really wanted to tell their story. And so I interviewed combat veterans, Marine veterans and Army infantry and paratroopers largely. And I wanted to try to tell the story, and many of them had never really been interviewed before, hadn't been interested, and hadn't wanted to be interviewed about their combat experience in Vietnam. But the fact that I was interested in trying to tell the story of their generation, and even more importantly of their friends who had died, they said yes, they would talk to me. And I had some remarkable interviews. And then I also interviewed probably 15 or so people who had a knock on the door telling them that their son or their spouse would not be coming home from Vietnam. And these were particularly powerful and moving stories all these years later. There are a few parts of my book that I still choke up when I look at again, not because of what I wrote, but because of what I was describing and what somebody said to me at the time that they encountered this. And I just want to try to tell the story of the baby boomer generation. We think of the baby boomers as the kids certainly who protested the war. When I came to Dartmouth, driving out from Madison, Wisconsin in the summer of 1969, I remember coming up off the New York Thruway and the New York Expressway, rather, near Albany, and coming north to cut across to Hanover, and seeing all of the Volkswagen microbuses with the wonderful pastel colors on them, and people hitchhiking along the road coming back from Woodstock. And that's an image that we have of the baby boomer generation, and it really was a remarkable generation of young people. But most people don't know that about 40% of the young men who were baby boom generation served in the military. About 10% of them served in Vietnam. That there are many more of them whose names are engraved on the Vietnam Wall than went to Canada or went to prison for refusing to be drafted. Now, I did interview some people who went to Canada and refused to be drafted, and I think that they're very much an admirable part of their own generation. I'm not being dismissive of them, but I wanted to tell the story of those who served, why they served, what they thought about doing, why did they go in, and they were very much children of the 60s, and we have to remember the 60s was a long decade. It wasn't just the late 60s. They were the children who heard John Kennedy say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. This was the generation that grew up in the 1950s being told that their world would be a world of tremendous opportunity, but that they had to remember that it was also a scary world. This was the world that grew up with duck and cover drills in the schools, where they learned, as I did in my small school in small town Midwest, to get under the school desk during a nuclear attack. We expected a nuclear attack. This was a world in which we were assured that we were in a contest with global communism. And this was a world in which we were told that we had that the United States had a responsibility to stand up to communism, and that we had a responsibility to serve our country. This was the world of the baby boomer generation. And when you talk to them, and I asked, I think probably each of the people I interviewed, why did you go in? Many of them enlisted. Some of them enlisted because they were facing the draft. Others enlisted eagerly because they wanted to serve. And often, time after time after time, they would say, my dad was a World War II veteran. I grew up in the world where I knew if I was called upon, I had to serve as well. And so I want to tell the story of that generation. And obviously, that most of them were disillusioned by their experience in Vietnam. They very quickly came to have serious doubts about the war. Most of them did not come home and protest the war. They were uneasy and sometimes even hostile toward the war protesters because they thought the protesters were dismissive of them. But some of them joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Most of them went about their lives. But they have been disillusioned by the war, by the leadership that led us to war, and by the nature of the leadership that carried out that war. And they went about their lives. They weren't treated very warmly. When they came home, there was not as much outright hostility, as some of the folklore would have us believe. Some of that came about, I think, from some disinformation that was out there about the anti-war left is all against the soldiers who were fighting, and they weren't. Some of them were hostile. I think you can see a change in the nature of attitudes toward the kids who were fighting the war. In 1965, when Lyndon Johnson first sent in combat troops, when the Marines went into Da Nang, in March of 65, followed quickly by significant numbers of Army battalions coming in, I think that the popular image in the United States was that these were heroic young Americans fighting in the jungles of Southeast Asia on behalf of democracy and against global communism. Within a few years, by let's say 67, as more and more American troops were involved, as more draftees were being called up and sent to Vietnam, as our casualties increased, and as there was a sense that the war seemed to have no real end, there was hostility toward the war, resentment toward the war, political opposition to the war picking up. That there had been political opposition as early as 65, surely, but this picked up significantly. And there was also a sense that the Vietnamese civilians were suffering greatly as a result of the war. And so the attitude toward the kids who were in Vietnam serving there was that these were poor kids who had been dragged off the street and sent to Vietnam to be involved in a cruel and costly and even immoral war. I think by late 1969, when the story broke about My Lai, about Lieutenant Calley, and the slaughter, really, of several hundred innocent Vietnamese at the village of My Lai in Vietnam, all of a sudden, in the minds of some, the kids who were fighting over there became not victims of a cruel and immoral war, but perpetrators of a cruel and immoral war. And it was just a major shift. I find it very troubling that probably in the 1970s, most Americans, if they were asked if they knew somebody serving in Vietnam, more of them would have known Lieutenant Calley than anyone else. It's not a good story. There were as many heroes in Vietnam as there have been in any war. You know from your own experience that war calls upon people, combat calls upon people to do some remarkable things, and it's not premeditated, it's done. You step up when you're facing a dangerous situation or your friends are facing danger. And the Vietnam had as many heroes as any war, but there are no publicly acclaimed heroes. It was not the sort of war from which we sort of saluted individuals as heroes. There weren't the Liberty Bond tours of World War II where we'd bring out all of the people, the survivors from Iwo Jima, to sell Liberty bombs. Right. It was just a different sort of war. I've called it the Apocalypse Now war. The movie Apocalypse Now was sort of, I think I describe it in the book as Vietnam meets Woodstock. It's sort of a sense of here's the 60s generation at war, killing and slaughtering civilians, and war with no purpose. And I said a few weeks ago, and I say this in the book really, but out in Burbank, California, in some remarks that I made there, I said that Apocalypse Now may be a good movie, but it's not good history. And the first person, there were a couple of hundred people in the room, and the first person to raise his hand after I finished speaking was somebody who said, I was a screenwriter on that movie, and it was historically accurate, and I didn't debate him in that forum. It's not history. It may be accurate in the way that movies often are in terms of uniforms and language and dress and equipment and other things that people do, and music, but it did not represent the war in Vietnam, and so that's the burden that generation came home with.
Now, being that you're an historian, it makes me wonder. The Vietnam generation was treated really worse than any other generation has ever been treated, as far as coming home and the treatment they received from the people back home. Why do you think there was this blimp in American, popular society where that generation got treated the worst? Because a lot of my buddies, we talk about how we feel like we're very fortunate, and that really the Vietnam generation kind of paved the way for us to get treated as kindly and as well as we do. And if you join the military nowadays, everyone's you're a hero. It's automatically assumed. And what was it? Just the climate of the country? You said maybe it was that generation. It just seems like it's a very unique time where there's a blimp of just a lot of negativity, and then it led back to a lot of positivity. Is there anything you can point to as historian to why that was the case?
I think it was opposition to the war, discomfort with the war, growing discomfort with stories about how it was being fought, of which My Lai was such a major negative example. There were plenty of instances in Vietnam, and I certainly described some of them in my book, where there were innocent civilians who were killed, and sometimes intentionally killed. There was nothing on the scale of My Lai, and most kids who served there did not conduct themselves that way, I can assure you. The Vietnam generation came home almost individually. Came home. You guys came home from Afghanistan with a unit.
Correct. Yeah, big unit, right?
And so your unit probably had a band playing when you stepped off the plane. These guys were not met by any bands. They came back alone, and they discovered. I think it's more indifference than it was, or maybe embarrassment, more than hostility. I talked to people and read accounts of people who would say, nobody asked me. One Army nurse talked about coming home and going to her small town where her local parish and the community had a potluck dinner with welcome home. And she realized afterwards that in this wonderful warm evening, nobody once mentioned the word Vietnam. Nobody once asked her what it was like in Vietnam. A kid said, somebody said, great tan. He said, I could have been in Florida for 6 weeks rather than Vietnam for 13 months. One young Marine said, nobody said a word to me about it. He said, my father fought in Iwo Jima in the Marines. And I thought, okay, my dad's going to want to talk to me about this. And my dad never asked what it was like. And he remembered this 45 years later. And then there was hostility. If not hostility, that exaggerates. There was certainly some concern within veterans organizations and the VA. They were pretty much filled up with World War II veterans, and there was a concern that this new generation was going to be competing with them for what they had, and they really thought of the Vietnam generation as being a bunch of hippies. And as one said, we won our war and you guys didn't. They described, one kid talked about going to see somebody at the VA about the tremendous nightmares and trauma that he was having. He had worked in Graves registration, so he really had heavy duty. And the World War II counselor that he met said, oh, come on, cut out this crap. We got over it, so can you guys. Get out of here. And he said he left and he never went back for 30 years, and by the time he went back, the VA was much more comfortable with it. There was not a recognition of post-traumatic stress. It was called in the early 70s the Vietnam syndrome, as if this thing, which was as old as Ulysses, as old as Shakespeare, as old as the Civil War when it was called soldier's heart, or combat fatigue in World War II, or shell shock in World War I. They called it the Vietnam syndrome, as if it was something unique to this whiny generation. It wasn't until the late 70s that there was a recognition post-traumatic stress and what it is and what it did to people and what the contribution that a stressful combat situation could add to that. And your generation is able now to get counseling on that, to talk to people, and you needn't feel embarrassed about it. You don't have something that's unique, that's sort of a failing of your own moral fiber or your own physical strength. It happens.
And I definitely feel like like I said, the Vietnam generation paved the way for us to be able to receive that kind treatment. I mean, and I have a good buddy of mine that was in my squad in Afghanistan, and he actually comes on the podcast and talks once in a while. And I was fortunate enough to go to his father's Vietnam infantry unit's reunion in Washington, D.C. a few years back. And yeah, it was just amazing hearing all these guys and what they had been through, and also how some of them were treated back home. You know, I know like I think my friend's father, like his own family didn't want to deal with him or talk to him, or at least not positive about his contribution. And I definitely think my generation owes a lot of deference to them paving the way, in the sense that they bore such a heavy burden. I think once the dust settled of the war and our popular culture looked back, there was this revulsion against how some people were treated. You know, the most extreme examples of the spitting on or the protesting. I think our culture said, whoa, we do need to make sure we draw a very hard line between the guys and gals fighting the war and the politicians making policy. And that was definitely, I think the Vietnam generation did that for us. It makes me think about a lot of these things. And like I said, you grew up during this time period. A lot of these people were friends or peers of yours, or at least you were alive watching this happen. You know, some of this might have led to you taking up the mantle and pushing veteran service and veterans education. And so it started for you going to Walter Reed, and from what I understand, like you were going and visiting wounded Marine soldiers, sailors, airmen, and I mean, were you recruiting them? Like, were you essentially recruiting them out of their bed to come to Dartmouth, or was it just encouraging them to go seek higher education? I mean, and what made you do that in the first place?
It's very interesting. You'll remember, as a Marine veteran, I'm sure, hearing tales of the Battle of Fallujah.
Absolutely.
In November of 2004, and it was some of the heaviest combat duty really since Vietnam. It was the heaviest combat urban street fighting certainly since Way during the Tet Offensive, and it was just difficult stuff. And I remember watching and reading accounts of this and saying, these kids that are over there are my age when I was in the Marines. They're the age of the students that I'm responsible for here at Dartmouth as president. And I wish I could do something to reach out to them. And I had this conversation one time with a friend who was a Marine veteran, and he said, well, why don't you go visit them at Bethesda Hospital? Why don't you go visit the Marines there? And he had a friend who was in the commandant's office and made a connection for me, and I got a pass to go visit Bethesda, and I went there in the summer of 2005. And I basically went bed to bed and sort of talked to everyone, asked them how they were doing. I always asked people what happened to them, and nobody ever said, I don't want to talk about it. And through that, you hear some fascinating stories, cruel, difficult stories about what happened to people. And I was invited to come back again, and I went back again, but I was always encouraging them to continue their education. And after, I think, a second or third visit, maybe it was to Walter Reed this time, and I was with the spouse, Mrs. Pace, whose husband, Peter Pace, was then the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And she said, you really need to do more of this college counseling when you talk to them. And I thought, well, that's a good idea. And so I got in touch with, but I'm not capable of doing that. I can talk about my experience. I can talk about Dartmouth, but I can't answer the sort of questions that people would have. I would like to go to a community college, perhaps near my home in Dallas. Do you think that they would accept the credits for the classes I took before? Or I'm thinking about going to this school, but since I have prosthetic legs, will they do they make accommodation in the dorms and elsewhere for me to be able to get around? I mean, some pretty basic and important questions that no single person can answer. So I got in touch with the guy who was the head of the American Council on Education, which is the largest umbrella group in higher education, and said, I think it would be good to set up a counseling program there, because you can call your organization, then can get specific information from every school in the country and can get it quickly. And he agreed, and I agreed to try to raise the money, and I did. I raised the money to get it started in late 2006, early 2007. It's still in place at Walter Reed Hospital. I'd raised subsequent money for it, and now I've got the counselor there. It's the same woman. She's just done a remarkable job, affiliated with the Semper Fi Fund,
right.
Which is I'm on the board of the Semper Fi Fund, so she's working with this organization. Now, there are not as many recently injured veterans coming back to the hospitals. I've been down to the hospitals probably 30 times, Taylor, but I haven't been there for 3 or 4 years, because the last time I was there just weren't that many new veterans coming in. But she's still doing counseling there, and I think it's very effective. Now, about Dartmouth, I recall after my first visit there talking to this one young Marine who had some gunshot wounds from the Battle of Fallujah. And, I encouraged him to go to school, and he was on medication, and, it's hard sometimes to have a really good conversation with people who are on medication because of their pain and their therapy. And but I got a handwritten note from him a month or so later, and he said, I've thought about when you came by, and he said, I decided I would like to go to college, and I decided I want to go to Dartmouth. And I wrote back to him and said, well, I'm really not recruiting for Dartmouth, and I would just encourage you to get well. And so we talked by phone. I encouraged him to go back home to recuperate from his wounds, and to maybe take a few classes at a nearby community college, just to see how it worked for him. And he wrote me after the first semester and said, I got all A's. Do you think I'm ready to come to Dartmouth? And I said, well, if you want to. And so I sent him a plane ticket and flew him up so he could take a look at the campus and see what he thought. And he came here, and in fact, that first year he came, there were 3 or 4, and they were all Marines, because that was where the network was working at that time, out of Bethesda. And this young man is now in medical school,
Wow.
and he's done well. I have never been explicitly recruiting for Dartmouth. I think people have to go where they're most comfortable. Sometimes it's near home. And I also have recognized that the generation that is enlisting in the professional military today, your generation, these are not young men and young women that are sort of thinking, well, I'm either going to enlist in the Army or maybe apply to MIT.
Right.
It's not a generation. The kids who are enlisting probably haven't taken any college prep courses. Maybe they haven't taken any SAT or AP exams. So college was not something that was necessarily what they were thinking about doing when they enlisted at age 18. I've often encouraged people to take a year, to go to a local school. And I've encouraged, when I was president, I encouraged our admissions people to look carefully at these applicants who are coming out of community colleges and other places where we normally don't have that many transfer applicants. I said, these are people just to look at. How are they doing? And I think you'd discover, if you look at most of the veterans who have come to Dartmouth, including on the Posse program, have all been essentially transfer students. They've taken at least a few classes someplace else, and I think that's an important thing to do. I love seeing veterans to Dartmouth. I just sent a note yesterday to some young men. They're all young men who have been admitted under the transfer program this month, telling them I'd be available to talk to them, to answer any questions they had, and congratulating them on it. And I just think it's terribly important that we do it. I would like to see even more veterans come here. This year's been very competitive at Dartmouth because of the high yield on the regular application process. I have a hunch that I don't know the numbers, but I have a hunch there'll be fewer transfer students coming in, period, this year because of that yield and a concern about the size of the entering classes next year. But I think we have to do it. And it's not, part of this is because I think a school like Dartmouth is very privileged, and privileged institutions have an obligation. We have an obligation to step up and to be a responsible citizen of the country. We have a responsibility to reach out to those who have served their country. But I also think that admitting veterans to Dartmouth is not some condescending favor that we're extending to some kid who served in the Army in Iraq, Afghanistan. This school is better because of the veterans who have come here. This school, I made a case many years about the value of diversity, and I truly think that it's an important value in a community. And it's because of a broader obligation that we have, but it enriches our education. We learn more when we're learning with and encountering and learning from students whose background and experiences are different from our own. That's clearly the case. And think of what the students who come to Dartmouth, very traditional in terms of age and their path. Think what they can learn from having a veteran sitting next to them in a seminar room or in a classroom. They can learn a great deal. We get more from you guys than you get from us, and so we continue to be in your debt.
I think that's a very good point you make too, is that it's not done in a sense of pity, because I think sometimes, that's sometimes how it can go when you have these veterans programs. Sometimes people can look at you as like, oh, well, you're someone that I need to pity and help, and oh, you poor thing, and that's not the case. We're a very resilient, hardworking group of people, and I remember when I was thinking about, I was transitioning out and going through different things. I had a mentor who was a retired admiral, and I would always be very hesitant to ask too much. He'd take time out and get coffee with me and talk to me, and I was just very appreciative that he'd take time out of his day as he's transitioning, and his transition entailed, starting his own company. So he's very busy, and I remember him telling me it was a great thing that I was humble, and I think a lot of veterans are humble. He's like, but you have to be a little bit more, almost like aggressive about asking for help. And he's like, and he said something that really helped me out. And he said, you're not asking for a handout, you're asking for an opportunity. He said, without you asking for a handout, I wouldn't come here and spend my workday talking to you. He goes back and tell you, you just want a chance to prove you can do it. And him saying that kind of reframed my thinking. I felt like I was being a beggar or something by asking for anything. He goes, no, you're not asking for me to just hand you money or something. He's like, you're just asking for a shot. And I think that's important for a lot of veterans. Like, a lot of guys and gals just want a shot at it. They're not asking you to hand them anything. And I think it's great that you and other educators and pushed this veterans and higher education need, because I think it is very much needed. And I think sometimes it's just a good message to get out there, because sometimes the veteran community itself, like the veterans themselves, I think self-cancel out. Like, they don't even think, well, Dartmouth, like, or any school. Like, it's not for me. Like, it's not. I didn't grow up that way. Like, I was a grunt. I was a Marine. I was a whatever. Like, I'm not gonna go to Dartmouth. Don't be silly. It's like it's a silly thing. Right? It's kind of like that. And that's kind of why I even started this podcast. I wanted to get all kinds of different voices. You have someone like you who's had all this experience as a Marine yourself, and then as a professor, and then as an administrator, and as the president of the college, all the way down to regular veterans. Say, hey, this is very doable. You can do this if you're willing. Like you said, to go to a community college or another school and put in the hard work so you can have some data, and then apply to somewhere or wherever you want to go. Like I said, whatever fits best for you. That's great. It's also important to know, I think some guys want to go to tech schools and vocational schools, and that's honorable and perfectly fine too. But I think it's good to get these voices out so guys can hear this is happening. People are going to these schools. There is a pathway. If I put the work in and I reach out and I apply, I actually have a shot at going someplace like this. And I think that's just sometimes a narrative that is just all too often, not put out there enough.
Yeah, and it's a different world today, Taylor, that your generation of veterans is encountering. The kids could come back from World War II or Korea or Vietnam, and if they wanted to do that, they could get a job in the local factory and probably count on having that job for 30 or 40 years and having a retirement package when they finished. As you well know, those opportunities are not there anymore, and anyone who imagines those opportunities will provide them a secure job for 30 or 40 years, it won't. If you look at the unemployment data for the current generation of veterans, it was higher for a while, but if you control for education, it was not. It's just that you're coming back. Almost all of the veterans, enlisted men and women who are getting out, do not have a college degree, obviously, and it's a different world today. And it's not just it is reaching out a hand and saying you can do this, but it's also this republic will be enriched by having your generation of veterans assume greater and greater positions of responsibility. You've already demonstrated that you're willing to sacrifice. You've already demonstrated that you can exercise leadership. You've already demonstrated that you know how to work well in a group of people. You've already demonstrated that you know how to take an order and follow it, and you also know how to exercise leadership yourselves. You've already demonstrated you can work in a very highly technological environment. You've already demonstrated that you can work in a very sensitive environment with people of different cultures and religions and backgrounds. You have demonstrated so much. You have so much to contribute. We have to provide ways to enable you to contribute, and we'll be the beneficiaries from that.
I think that's such an important message, that a lot of guys and gals, the reason you join, we all have many reasons why we join, but I think for most people there is some part of you that has that want, that civic duty, that patriotism or what have you, and a lot of guys and gals lack purpose when they get out. Like when I counsel guys and people that are struggling, especially from the infantry community, because that's where I come from, it's usually lack of purpose that I think plagues most people. And I've said this in other podcasts numerous times, but it can be anywhere from just trying to find a job to they're having some serious suicidal thoughts. Or, I've talked to guys on the phone that had the gun to their head, and I'm like, dude, don't do it. And I say this all the time, but no matter what part of the spectrum you're on, when I start talking to them, it's always lack of purpose. And I try to tell people, look, you can retool your warrior mindset. Just because you don't hold a weapon anymore doesn't mean you can't take all that energy and all that drive and repurpose it. Your new weapon can be a pencil. It can be a pen. It can be, like you did some veterans advocacy work with the Yellow Ribbon program. You could that right there will change more veterans' lives than anything else. So if you have a drive to still serve your nation, if you have a drive to still serve, your populace of veterans, a good pathway, it's not the only pathway, but a good pathway is going to school, getting your degree, and there's so many ways you can give back. Whether, like I said, it doesn't have to be vets. It can just be society as a whole, right? But for those who really are still holding on to that identity, and that's really important to them, well, there's a lot of veterans advocacy work to be done, whether it's like that gentleman you mentioned went to medical school, or someone who wants to become a lawyer or get involved in politics. I mean, there's so many different ways you can make a difference. And so many guys sit at home and they're trying to figure it out, and they don't have purpose, and they're working odd jobs, they don't know what to do. And I try to tell them, like, this isn't the only way, but doing school is a good way to relight that fire you had, that fire you had when you first joined, when you were a new Marine. You wanted to really prove yourself to your senior Marines really bad, and you had this drive to serve, and you're so motivated. Refine that and repurpose it, and for school.
Yeah.
And then, any closing thoughts from you before we head out for today, or?
No, I'm just delighted to be part of this podcast, and I admire you so much for coming to Dartmouth as a student, and for taking on the difficult problems of transitioning to this new environment, this new school, and saying, even while I'm doing this, I want to try to share through this podcast a network some of my own experiences and the ideas of some people that'll come in here to talk to me. So you've already demonstrated the point that I just made, which is you guys have so much to contribute. Our responsibility in the most selfish sense is to enable you to do that. It is a handout, but there's nothing gratuitous. There's nothing condescending. You have earned that handout by your service, and we have a responsibility, and finally we can be the beneficiaries from that.
Absolutely. And so if anyone is listening, especially veterans or friends or family of veterans, if you listen to any of these podcasts, you'll see this central theme. But there is a way to re-find your purpose. There is a way to go to schools, and if you want to, there is a way to go to top-tier schools. These things are happening. It is getting done. You can hear voices like President Wright, all the way down to other veterans podcasts I have, and just listening to different veterans profiles. And not everyone's path is perfect and clean and easy, and most even veterans that are here that I know had a lot of struggle or a lot of bumps, or they had failures, or they had times they didn't do well. But you just keep at it and you keep at it, and you can eventually get somewhere pretty awesome. Because if you'd have told me 2 years ago that I would be at Dartmouth College, I would have thought you're kind of being a jerk, because that's kind of so far out there. It's like, okay, really, you're an Ivy League school? Like, come on, let's be serious. But it is possible. And like you said, it doesn't have to be an Ivy League. It can be your closest school, whatever it is. Just get out there, get involved, take some classes, at least get your feet wet and try. And I hope anyone listening can listen to the totality of these podcasts and get motivated by that. And like I said, just try one class or two, and you'd be surprised. Most guys I talked to that told me they thought they're kind of dumb, right? They didn't try hard in high school. Maybe they didn't go to good high school. They joined the Marines, didn't really, weren't becoming scholars while they were also becoming warriors. They were just focused on their job. But they got out and they went to college, and they were doing better than the kids around them, because they had those skills you mentioned. They had those capabilities you mentioned, and they were more studious, more disciplined, and they'd grown up. And some of it is even they had done a lot of manual labor and a lot of filling sandbags, and they're like, that's great and all, but I'm kind of over that. So what's the next step? So whatever it is, there can be a drive from your past military service that kind of drives you to want to pursue these things. I want to thank President Wright for coming on the podcast today. And with that, you've been listening to the Greenside Podcast.